On the 1st of December 2004, 20 years ago, a speculative evolution documentary about dragons was released. I say this as this fictitious documentary has a bunch of different titles across regions. It is known as The Last Dragon in the UK, Dragon's World in other parts of Europe, and Dragons: A Fantasy Made Real in North America. For this video, I'm just going to refer to the show as Dragons. It was created in an association between the UK's Channel 4 and the US's Animal Planet and originally aired on both channels. The UK version is narrated by the late Sir Ian Holm, whilst the US version is done by Sir Patrick Stewart. Two fantastic actors to choose from. I wonder if the former's appearance in the Lord of the Rings films influenced the producer's choice at all. Either way, it just feels right to hear Bilbo Baggins himself talk about dragons. The show portrays a theoretical natural history of dragons as though they were real animals that lived alongside the dinosaurs and later humans until being driven to extinction by the latter. I think that concept alone is enough to sell this show. Dragons and dinosaurs, I feel, are one of the very few things that are pretty universally viewed as cool, or at least liked by most people. So I'd say the show's got a good backing out the gate. Whilst that alone would be entertaining in its own right, the fact they fleshed this concept out with so much speculative, though very plausible, science is incredibly admirable. As the North American title says, they really do manage to make these creatures of fantasy and folklore feel like real animals that once lived on our planet. We are treated to 4 species of dragon, each with their own unique designs and speculative biology. They were designed by veteran paleo and fantasy artist John Sibbick and were modelled and animated by the insanely talented team at Framestore, many of whom also worked on the Walking With series, and it shows, as the models all have wonderfully detailed textures and patternings, and they are animated beautifully. I've always been intrigued by this show, as it's so strange, as it doesn't quite seem to fit one category. Is it a nature documentary? A paleontology documentary? A history documentary? I guess you could say that adds to its charm that it's so hard to pin down. Now that sounds like a lot of praise, and indeed it is, and I feel it's warranted, at least for the actual dragon scenes. But I'll get into that later. Without further ado, let's look into dragons. The opening sequence has various shots of the CGI dragons transitioning between digital monitors and various historical depictions of dragons throughout various cultures across human history, such as ancient Chinese parchment, European stained glass windows, and even modern computers. The narration makes a very interesting point that many human cultures have tales of dragons or dragon-like entities within their folklore. Granted, some of these are likely cases of mistaken identity, or just not of the mortal realm at all. But it does beg an interesting question. Why do all these unrelated cultures have depictions of such similar beings? The show suggests, of course, that it was because dragons were a real group of animals that lived across the globe, with various species becoming ingrained into the folklore of different regions. The music was composed by Richard Blair Oliphant, and it is really good stuff. Very epic, fantastical orchestrations that perfectly fit the theme of the show, as well as some other tracks, which I'll talk about later. After the titles, we start out in Montana 65 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous period. The date for the end of the Cretaceous has since been pushed back to 66 million, but this was correct at the time. This segment was filmed in La Palma in the Canary Islands, a very common filming location for paleodocs. Before we get to the main stars of dragons, let's first talk about this T-Rex model. Dragons, let me level with you. You have no business making one of the most accurate depictions of T-Rex from the time. The only errors I can spot are the wrists being pronated and the nostrils being too high on the snout, and the tongue likely wasn't this mobile, but otherwise its anatomy looks pretty spot on. It's now thought not to have roared like is shown here, but rather have communicated with low frequency rumbles with its mouth closed. It has been having prey stolen from its territory. Following its nose, it finds the first species of the main stars of the show, the prehistoric dragon. Now, at the risk of being crucified by fantasy buffs, I believe it is technically a wyvern, as it is tetrapodal. That is, it has 4 limbs, with the hind limbs acting as walking legs and the front limbs forming wings. Most depictions of dragon wings in media are very bat-like, and these are much the same, having extremely long fingers connected by a thin skin membrane forming the wing's flight surface. Like bats, it also has a single claw on its first finger. On this young male, they have large red patches on the underside, perhaps a form of eye spot for intimidation, as seen when it bluffs and raises its wings to seem larger than it is to the T-Rex. The rest of the body is very theropod dinosaur-like. It has a long S-curved neck, sharp teeth for cutting into flesh, a very rounded head with large horns, which are known on some theropod dinosaurs, a deep torso, long tail for balance, and the legs especially are very reminiscent of a theropod. They're positioned directly under the body, and the feet have 4 toes, 3 for walking and 1 held off the ground. They do have weird spur-like claws that protrude from their ankles. Not sure what that's about, but it looks cool, I guess. It has a mottled dark brown or black back with a white or cream underbelly. The young male has splashes of red on its head and wings, and I think it's really cool that different individuals have their own colour schemes. I love this design. It's very theropod-like, and as such feels believable as a creature living in the Mesozoic. It also shares many sound effects with the Therizinosaurus from Chased by Dinosaurs. After a bluff doesn't work, the young dragon unleashes an incredibly loud screech that carries for miles and hurts the T-Rex's ears, but doubles as a distress signal. Undeterred, the dinosaur moves in, barely holding the T-Rex off. From the sky, the young dragon's mother swoops down and slashes the dinosaur's head with its talons. She has yellow underwings, as do all females presumably. The T-Rex bites down on her left wing, breaking it, making her resort to another signature trait of dragons. She breathes fire, burning the dinosaur's face and scorching the surrounding plants, which looks awesome. This encounter proves to be fatal for both parties, as the narration claims the T-Rex won't last the night, and the mother is unable to hunt with a broken wing. How did it breathe fire? How does such a large and heavy-looking animal fly? Well, these questions are actually answered, some by the narration over the animated scenes, whereas others are, explained with a different approach. See, intercut between the animated scenes with the dragons on environmental backplates, the various adaptations these creatures have are shown through a subplot, if you can call it that, of an American paleontologist, Jack Tanner, played by British actor Paul Hilton, examining a T-Rex skeleton with strange injuries and scorch marks on its skull. Sound familiar? Ignoring the fact that it says it's London when it's the Oxford Museum of Natural History, and that in this timeline, the T-Rex mount based on Sue is actually the individual found by Jack Tanner. He apparently became famous for this discovery, but then, quote, blew it, by suggesting the pathologies and scorch marks on the skull were caused by a dragon, which he admits may have been inspired by his childhood obsession. So, yeah, you could probably see where this is going. He's ridiculed by the scientific community, and I mean, yeah, even though we just saw what actually happened, I don't think this is solid evidence for a dragon attack. Not to play devil's advocate, but if I didn't know any better, I'd assume the claw marks were from another T-Rex, perhaps from a territorial dispute with this individual perhaps falling to the ground and being scratched by the foot claws of its opponent, and then may have come across a natural fire soon later, such as a flaming tree branch collapsing on it perhaps. Wild imagination aside, Jack Tanner is weird, man. The way he's dressed and the language used by him tries to give the impression that he's cool, laid back and relatable. Yet he joins the ranks of Robert Winston from Walking with Cavemen in being an absolute animal. This guy is unhinged, and it's so distracting from the very commendable speculative science presented here. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't get a lot of ironic enjoyment out of it. Throughout the show, he constantly pushes towards the existence of dragons by grasping at straws, and whilst he is of course right, he is not a very disciplined scientist. He does have his own theme music though that uses a lot of guitars, and it is pretty cool, not gonna lie. Being dubbed Dragon Man, which in these circumstances is not actually a cool nickname, he is thrown a lifeline by the discovery of several bodies by some skiers in an ice cave in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania. These included several men wearing knight's armour dated to the Middle Ages and a large unknown animal, a dragon. The Romanian government contacts the museum, and as the man with no reputation to lose, he volunteers to fly out to Romania to investigate the body with a small team of scientists on the museum's behalf. With Tanner being the fall guy if word gets out the museum even entertained the idea of dragons existing, and it loses its reputation. Splendid. I care immensely. For starters, those pesky Romanians moved the body off-site to an undisclosed location which even Tanner points out could have potentially destroyed crucial evidence, but at the site, they perform an autopsy on the creature's cryogenically frozen corpse, and it's in these scenes where they dissect it and uncover the truth about many of the dragon's biological adaptations. A full-body puppet of the dragon's corpse was made by Crawley Creatures, who also made the practical effects for Walking With, and it looks fantastic. Whilst these scenes are a cool idea, I feel they could have been done better. Tanner's antics and his colleagues' understandable dismissiveness of his wild theories just make these scenes hard to take seriously, and I end up just wanting to get back to the dragons. My very good friend Ancient Realms has actually made a re-edit of this show with these scenes omitted, so it's just the dragon scenes. A link to the video and also their channel will be in the description. Not wearing a lab coat, but this horrendous knitted jumper that I imagine would just get caught on everything. Ugh. Whilst the aspect ratio of the dragon's wings would suggest they're too small for it to fly, scans of the corpse reveal its bones are filled with air spaces, like those of birds, making it lightweight. Upon dissecting its chest, they find large, hollow, lung-like organs filled with an unknown gas, which Tanner extracts a sample of with a syringe without wearing a mask. What? Back in the Cretaceous, after 2 weeks, the dragon's mother has died and is attracting scavenging pterosaurs. These appear to be pteranodontids of some kind, as you never really get a good view of the model. When the show aired, this family of pterosaurs were thought to have been extinct by this time, but pterosaur bones ID'd as indeterminate pteranodontids have since been found in the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, so maybe by complete accident, these creatures did actually exist. The young dragon feeds on his mother's corpse to stay alive, and we get a cool internal shot showing that the gut microbiota of dragons produce a lot of hydrogen. This gas is stored in the flight bladders and produces lift, helping them to fly. An old male dragon then arrives with a broken horn. Rather than scavenging, it chooses to chase the young male on foot. After a brief chase, the young male coughs up the undigested meat, weighing him down, allowing him to take his first flight. Exhausted, the older male gives up the chase. I love this shot of the old male watching the young dragon fly off from this ridge. The angle, lighting and fog just makes it look very primal. I can't describe why, but it's just so cool. I personally think the flight bladder concept is very plausible, and the gut flora producing gases for lift is a really creative idea based on a real-world phenomenon, as all animals have unique microorganisms within their digestive systems that can produce various chemicals when they break down organic matter. Opening the dragon carcass's mouth with a jack Jack Tanner looks inside to find that in addition to its sharp incisor teeth at the front, it also has flat molars at the back. On them were traces of platinum, which when combined with hydrogen combusts, to which Tanner shows some potential pyromaniacal traits in an experiment to show this. He also spots a false palate at the back of the throat, a feature seen in crocodiles to prevent water from flowing into their lungs when they open their mouths. Tanner speculates that in dragons it may have been for preventing backdraft when they breathed fire, and then looks like a sad child when his colleagues dismiss his theory. Aww. Tanner is, of course, exactly right. In the Cretaceous, several years later, our dragon is seen flying high above the sea, perhaps the Western Interior Seaway, which divided North America at the time, aka Hell's Aquarium. What a crossover that would be. He is planning to challenge another male for his territory and for access to females. He grinds up some rocks from a cliff face in its mouth. These deposits contain platinum, which acts as a catalyst for his fire breath. The flight bladders also act as a fuel source for breathing fire, which when released from the mouth reacts with the platinum deposits on their molars and combusts, creating fire with the bony false palate protecting the throat from the backdraft. A very plausible explanation for fire breathing if you ask me. This also creates an interesting trade-off, as breathing fire means emptying a dragon's flight bladders, potentially hindering its ability to fly in an emergency. This weakness is demonstrated in a really interesting way, with the resident male using fire as an intimidation display to show his fitness, and again in a dogfight between our dragon and the resident male, who by the way also has a unique colour scheme, being mainly black with little to no additional colours. The latter breathes fire quite liberally during the battle, whereas our dragon conserves his fire, waiting for his rival to tire and run low on gas. Our dragon triumphs, winning the territory and the resident female. His success, however, is short-lived, as the Chicxulub meteorite hits the Earth, causing ecological devastation in the KPG mass extinction, which at the time was known as the KT event. Since the dragon found in Romania was found alongside medieval humans, dragons must have survived this extinction event, whilst the non-avian dinosaurs didn't. Whilst this is true, the prehistoric dragon did in fact go extinct, which I think is cool that certain lineages of this made-up clade become extinct, as it helps it feel more fleshed out and believable, as extinction is extremely common, even in successful groups. This means the prehistoric dragon was not the ancestor of the Romanian specimen. This leads us to the second dragon species, a distant cousin of the prehistoric dragon, the marine dragon. As you'd expect, the marine dragon looks like the inspiration for sea serpents from folklore, with a long, sinuous body, having convergently evolved an extremely similar body plan to the unrelated nothosaurs from the Triassic period. You unfortunately don't get to see it much, with it having the shorter screen time of the four dragons by far. The only scenes it appears in are those of it in a river or estuary at an unspecified time and place in the Cenozoic era. I assume these scenes were also filmed in the Canary Islands, unless I'm mistaken. I do love how it breaks the surface as it swims through the shallow part of the river here. That's a nice touch. It has a very pale bluish grey colour scheme and a much longer snout than the prehistoric dragon. It too has horns, but they form an almost mane-like frill at the back of the head, with the largest on the top corners and those on the sides almost forming a kind of connected frill. Its body shape is very hydrodynamic, with short horns to reduce drag and a rudder-shaped tail for paddling. Whilst it does have a flight bladder, it's incapable of flight or breathing fire. Instead, it's more of a swim bladder for adjusting its buoyancy in water. It also has a false palate, but it's used to stop water from flowing into the lungs when the mouth is open, like in crocodilians. In addition to its nostrils being placed high on the snout, also like crocodilians. Perhaps the most interesting feature of the marine dragon is its wings. Unlike the prehistoric dragon, it has 4 legs, as well as a third limb pair that form bat-like membranous wings. Whilst the dragons in the show are within the clade tetrapoda, the marine dragon lineage gained an extra pair of limbs. This can happen in nature, as genetic abnormalities can cause animals to develop additional limbs, a condition known as polymelia. If we assume in this case, at some point in the dragon lineage, an ancestor gained an extra limb pair during embryonic development, and it successfully reproduced and passed on this trait to its offspring, over generations they could have become functional wings. The narration implies that the ancestors of the marine dragon had large wings for flight, meaning its wings shrank when it took to an aquatic lifestyle, or vice versa. This means that there may have been other flying hexapod dragons living in the Cretaceous alongside the marine dragons, a ghost lineage essentially. I commissioned my incredibly talented friend Ancient Realms to create some concept art for what an ancestor of the marine dragon may have looked like, and it is spectacular. A massive thank you to them. Now, things get a bit complicated from a scientific point of view. The show presents the dragon group, or clade, as monophyletic. That is, a group that includes a common ancestor, all of its descendants, and nothing else. Here, the prehistoric dragon is shown as the most basal member, which makes sense as it looks the most different to the others with only 4 limbs, suggesting it branched off first. All the other dragons are hexapods, 6 limbs with 4 legs and an additional pair of wings. Based on the only very blurry image we have of the ancestral dragon seen here in the cladogram, it looks to have 4 definite legs and a weird sail or perhaps wing-like structure on its back. What this nondescript structure is has strong implications for the phylogeny of these dragons. If this is some kind of display structure, like a Dimetrodon-style sail, it could be an ancestral trait that the later forms lost and would mean that the ancestral dragon was 4-limbed. In this scenario, the prehistoric dragon's lineage retained the ancestral 4 limbs, with its front limbs becoming wings, and the marine dragon lineage evolving a 3rd limb pair that became wings. If these are meant to be wings, however, that means that dragons were ancestrally hexapods. In this scenario, the marine dragon lineage retained the ancestral limb condition, whereas the prehistoric dragon lineage lost the extra limb pair, either losing its front legs or losing its wings, and its front legs then became wings, or its 2 front limb pairs fused together. Because of this confusing evolutionary path, I favour the ancestral tetrapodal dragon scenario. A possible alternative phylogeny would have dragons as polyphyletic, a group that contains a mix of taxa regardless of their relations based on some other aspect. In this scenario, the prehistoric dragon is not actually a dragon cladistically, but rather a dinosaur, specifically a Scansoriopterygid, a strange family of theropods that includes the bizarre E, which had bat-like membranous wings and are thought to have been gliders. They were all quite small and only known from the Jurassic, but if they persisted into the late Cretaceous, perhaps one lineage grew larger, lost its feather covering and grew horns, resulting in the prehistoric dragon convergently evolving fire-breathing, a false palate, and a flight bladder, possibly from the avian air sac respiratory system. These animals were not known to have had bat-like wings at the time, so it would have been impossible to incorporate this idea. As for the marine dragon lineage, I believe these do represent a monophyletic group, the true dragons, if you will, which all share a hexapodal common ancestor. This is purely a thought experiment on my part though. Some marine dragons eventually returned to living on land. They then diversified into a variety of terrestrial forms. I think having a fossilized false palate being discovered in China prior, but being erroneously thought to belong to a crocodile, was a clever way to segue into the next segment. Despite having its own model, most shots that are supposed to be the marine dragon use that of the 3rd dragon species, the forest dragon. Perhaps the marine dragon was the last model to be finished, meaning some shots had to be animated with the forest dragon to meet production deadlines, or maybe it was just an honest mistake by the animators. I don't know. The forest dragon is one of the descendants of marine dragons that return to living on land. It inhabits the bamboo forests of China 50,000 years ago in the Pleistocene epoch during the last ice age, or rather the last glacial period of the current ice age. It looks like the inspiration for the dragons in East Asian folklore, with a long, sinuous body similar to its ancestor. It fittingly has a mottled green colour scheme for blending in with its forest habitat. Its horns are very similar to those of the marine dragon, but the two at the corners on top of the head are much longer and taller. Interestingly, its legs are positioned under the body like dinosaurs and the prehistoric dragon, rather than having a sprawling gait like crocodilians, suggesting it was also an ancestral trait of dragons. The narration implies that the forest dragon's similar appearance to its marine ancestor is to be expected due to being, quote, recently adapted from water. The wording is a bit confusing. Does it mean recently as in chronologically, implying that the forest dragon 50,000 years ago only recently came to live on land? Or does it mean in an evolutionary sense, implying that its morphology hasn't changed much from its marine ancestors, which doesn't specify when in the Cenozoic they came back onto land? Does this mean dragons were primarily aquatic throughout this era? The Old Animal Planet website apparently stated that the forest dragon swam to the Japanese archipelago from China, evolving as distinct species on both landmasses, suggesting it was indeed a recent arrival to land, or was amphibious like crocodilians. I wonder if there was originally going to be a scene showing this that was cut, which might explain why we see its model swimming in shots that are supposed to be the marine dragon. Its flight bladders help it move quietly across the forest floor, and a unique adaptation the forest dragon has is that it uses the gases of its flight bladders to change the pitch of its voice for vocal mimicry, which is an extremely cool and interesting use for this fictional organ that also feels very plausible, which is wonderful. A female uses this ability to imitate an amorous female boar to lure a male close enough to attack. Her hunt is interrupted by a tiger roaring nearby that scares off the pigs. The forest dragon retains the small wings of its ancestor, making it incapable of powered flight, but still able to make short glides, which it does here to cross a river, which I think is the exact same one the marine dragon scenes were filmed in, unless I'm mistaken. Wanting to get rid of the competition, she hunts down this invader to her territory. The dragon mimics the sound of a boar in distress to entice the tiger towards her, thinking there's an easy meal. The tiger races towards the sound with stock footage of a tiger running through grass. Guys, could you not find footage of it in a forest at least? The dragon PG ratings the tiger to death off screen, and later that night uses its fire breath to burn the carcass, as cooked meat is easier to digest. This has quite interesting evolutionary implications, as its ancestor used its false palate to stop water flow, which itself was descended from terrestrial forms. This means that either the marine dragon's ancestors had the false palate for fire, adapted it for water, and then became adapted for fire again, via atavism, a phenomenon in biology where an organism evolves a trait or feature reminiscent of an ancestor's. The forest dragon's tiger barbecue attracts another predatory mammal, early humans. They are shown to use the dragon's fire against it, and would go on to use it to create farmland and to forge metal weapons. It's here that the Tannis subplot tries to throw in some drama, in that the team is running out of time to examine the dragon corpse because the museum will be taking it, and then Tanner won't be able to get a look at it because I don't know. I feel like in this scenario it should be the other way around, where the scientist should be the deciding factor for when the body can be taken away, but that doesn't create drama, which is apparently needed in this documentary. This is also when the team realizes it has 6 limbs, not just 4, which is kind of weird as we, the audience, can clearly see that both the marine and forest dragons have 6 limbs, so it feels weird to have this revelation for the characters be here, as it creates a weird disconnect to the audience, whereas if this had been established earlier, it would have been fine. The Tanner segments truly are baffling. They do at least establish that the extra limb pair is due to a genetic mutation. They also find a sharp metal point in its heart, which they discover is the broken off tip of a sword, proving that people were in fact in conflict with dragons and that their human bodies were scorched. Oh, but just as they're about to freeze the body again, Tanner just in time notices there are oviducts on the scans, but they show no signs of follicular activity, meaning it is an immature animal, a juvenile. Following this evidence trail, the team heads up to the mountains to examine the cave site where the bodies were found. We are then taken back to the year 1475, where we're introduced to the fourth and final species of dragon, at least in CGI, the mountain dragon. Its design is reminiscent of the European, or Western, dragons of folklore, having 4 legs and a pair of huge wings. Considering it too is a descendant of the marine dragon, which itself has terrestrial ancestors with large wings, the mountain dragon may represent a form similar to the ancestor of this lineage by evolving huge wings for flight, again via atavism. Like those of the prehistoric dragon, the mountain species' wings are bat-like and membranous, supported by elongated fingers. This adult female has a mottled green colour with a cream underbelly, with pale orange stripes on its flanks and spots on the tips of its underwings. Its tail ends with a sort of lance head shape, which reminds me of the tail veins of some pterosaurs, and can be used for defence. It also has much longer legs than its marine and forest relatives, presumably to aid in its more active lifestyle as an aerial predator, rather than relying mainly on stealth and to traverse its often uneven, rocky habitat. It also uses many of the sound effects that would later be used for the T-Rex in Prehistoric Park. The narration states that mountain dragons once fed on the Pleistocene megafauna of the Mammoth Steppe that stretched across much of the northern hemisphere during Ice Age glacial periods. Due to their extinction and human habitation, they have been forced into remote habitats at high altitudes and killing farm animals, sparking a war on them by humans, as was first hinted at with the forest dragon. Mountain dragons are now critically endangered. The female leaves her scent around her territory, hoping the winds will carry it to the nose of a male while she is in season. Otherwise, she will have to wait another entire year before she comes into season again. She returns to her den, the ice cave in the mountain, which has similar insulating properties to an igloo, making it much warmer than it is outside. In addition, the mountain dragon has another, more unorthodox method of thermoregulation. It has inherited a blood protein from her marine ancestor that stops her tissues from freezing. Antifreeze proteins, or AFPs, are known in several species of polar fish and to have evolved independently many times. So I think it's plausible a marine reptile could have also done so, and for a non-marine descendant to retain said protein. AFPs in marine fish are thought to have evolved due to the freezing of Antarctica and the formation of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, or ACC. This cold water current drove many cold-intolerant fish to extinction, but those with AFPs survived. Perhaps the marine dragon was under the same selection pressure, and this is when it evolved AFPs as well. If we assume this to be the case, this gives us a rough time frame for when the marine dragon evolved its AFPs to live in cold waters, that the mountain dragon would inherit and use for living at frigid high altitudes. The ACC formed roughly 34 million years ago when Australia and South America detached from Antarctica, allowing the current to encircle the continent around the South Pole, causing cold water to circulate around the globe. From this, we can deduce that the mountain dragon's lineage only became terrestrial after this time. Due to the derived appearance of its wings, legs, and tail compared to those of the forest dragon, I'm inclined to think the mountain dragon lineage came back onto land earlier than that of the forest dragon, as not only does the narration imply that the forest species only recently came back onto land, it would give the mountain dragon lineage more time to evolve such huge specialized structures. Whilst on the topic of ancestry, I want to very briefly talk about the most enigmatic species of dragon in the show, the unseen desert dragon. Now, its only appearance, if you can even call it that, is as text on the cladogram as a third unnamed descendant of the marine dragon. It apparently shares a more recent common ancestor with the forest dragon than the mountain dragon. Because of this, I personally envisioned this unseen creature as also having small wings. The, and I'm probably going to butcher this pronunciation, Mushushu, which I keep wanting to call Mushu, from the Babylonian legends of the Mesopotamian region, which today is the country of Iraq, was drake-like with a snake-like tongue and strong forelimbs, which to me sounds similar to a giant anteater. So perhaps it similarly had an insectivorous diet. I also commissioned Ancient Realms to create some concept art for the desert dragon, using the Mushushu as a baseline, and it is, of course, wonderful. Tanner discovers dragon feces preserved in the ice, and he deceives his colleague by telling her to bag it and smashes it with his hammer. Surely that was unnecessary, and you could have said you wanted to have a look inside it rather than this chicanery. Well, they find evidence of tropical plant remains in the dung, suggesting that its maker had its last meal in a much warmer climate. The team also found scorch marks on rocks near the cave. This leads us to the appearance of a nomadic male mountain dragon from the Atlas Mountains of North Africa, which has a brown colour scheme and orange underwings, and I think I actually prefer it to the female one. Having caught the female scent, the two partake in a mating ritual where they interlock their talons and skydive. Before they hit the ground, they release and breathe fire, leaving scorch marks across the mountain face. Considering how elaborate some modern animal mating rituals can be, I don't think this is too much of a stretch, personally, and it's a cool way to link the present day investigation with the animated one in 1475. It's a wonderful sequence and beautifully animated. Tanner then finds a pile of stones and just sticks his hand in, because of course he does, and pulls out an egg shell fragment. Just as he thinks there was only the one hatched egg, he finds a second unhatched one. Whoa! This stone nest is used by mountain dragons as an incubating chamber, fueled by their own fire. The stones both protect the eggs from being blasted and also retain heat. The narration states that their shells have fire-resistant properties, which I haven't been able to find anything on living animals with something similar, so if you know more about this than me, please do let me know in the comments. The male returns empty-handed from hunting, but at least brings a stone to add to the nest. The fiercely defensive female permits him to enter the cave. Another adaptation the mountain dragon is shown to have is a heat-sensitive tongue used to gauge the nest temperature. Like some modern reptiles, the egg's sex is temperature determinant. Males require higher temperatures, and so to avoid potential competition in the future, the father lowers the nest temperature to encourage female development by breathing whatever this is. I'm sure it's not ice breath or anything like that, but surely even cold breath would just make the flame stronger, right? So I'd figure the best way to reduce the temperature would be to just let the fire continue to burn, or cheekily remove some of the stones to let more heat escape. The male's questionable fatherhood doesn't end there though, as when the female returns from hunting, he's lounging outside and ends up letting the nest temperature fall dangerously low, killing one of the unhatched embryos. Wanting to avoid the mother's rage, the deadbeat leaves, presumably to buy milk. And we'll definitely be back soon, right, Dad? The team then find the bones of domesticated sheep, the only plentiful food left for the dragons, to which Tanner calls her a silly girl. Okay. The mother does this to keep her now fairly large daughter fed. She has a pretty cool mix of her parents' colourings. We later see them huddling together for warmth, using their wings to bask in the sun's rays. I hope they don't get too much harmful UV radiation at such high altitude. The mother also teaches her daughter to collect platinum from the deposit in their cave. The mother struggles to find enough food for herself and her baby before they hibernate. It's interesting that the narration calls it hibernating, as reptiles don't hibernate like mammals during the winter, but rather brumate, a similar activity that differs in that reptiles don't sleep during brumation, and also still drink water. Perhaps hibernating was chosen as it's a more well-known word, or maybe the mountain dragon actually convergently evolved a mammalian form of hibernation. The mother's raiding of farms aggravates the locals, and we see a hunting party of mercenaries hired to hunt down the Mountain Devil. It's honestly quite eerie seeing these humans hunting the dragon within their dark cave, lit only by torchlight. Eventually they find the juvenile, unable to breathe fire yet. She is helpless as the assassins kill her whilst her mother is out hunting. When the mother returns, she finds her daughter has been turned into a practical effect and wails in mourning. The assassins waited in the cave, with one morbidly wearing her daughter's blood on his face. He narrowly escapes her flame breath, but his compatriot gets roasted. Dragons can apparently feel loss and mourn their dead, similar to some modern animals. The adult comes back into season and begins the process of finding a mate again. We get a cool scene of her using the knight's armor to hopefully attract a male, stating that dragons are naturally attracted to shiny objects, which would make sense considering they'd often be on the lookout for glinting platinum deposits, and maybe also why dragons are often attracted to treasure in stories. The narration morbidly states that the male is likely dead, and implies she may in fact be the last dragon. Roll credits! The female enters hibernation, with the narration foreshadowing that she will be as vulnerable as her daughter was. The team find evidence of a person having been scorched by fire, and decide to tunnel through an ice wall. Upon finding another body, Tanner sees it's crushed underneath something. Said thing is an enormous wing, to which he is so excited he screams to the heavens. This body was part of a second, larger hunting party sent to kill her. With such low reserves of food and gas, she can't breathe fire. She doesn't go down without a fight though. Cornered, she still manages to take out all but one of the knights without fire. The last man standing, lying, takes a spear, points it upwards as the dragon stomps down on him, crushing him but impaling her in the process. I suppose it's kind of fitting that both the first and last dragons we see were killed by those who viewed it as encroaching on their territory, bringing things full circle in a way. The show ends back in the quote-unquote London Natural History Museum, where the corpses of both the mother and daughter mountain dragons are cryogenically preserved together, with the narrator wondering if these truly were the last dragons. 1 year later, Tanner is handed a report of something, presumably dragon-related, to which he excitedly runs off, flapping his arms like dragon wings as his theme plays, leading to the credits. I guess that's a pretty fitting note to end things on. So, The Last Dragon's World, a fantasy made real. What are you? You're not really a paleodoc, you're not archaeology, and you're not fantasy. I guess you're speculative evolution, maybe? It's not just your identity that makes my head hurt, so does Tanner. I think the structure being a mix of animated scenes with modern forensic scenes is fine. The latter were just done in such a stupid way, and I just do not understand why they went this direction with them. In essence, when Dragons is focused on the dragons, it is an awesome and truly unique documentary. There's nothing else quite like it. Tanner though, he's just so weird and over the top. Them trying to work drama into it is just so odd and unnecessary too. Like, does anyone really care about the stakes of this ragtag team of scientists? No, I want to see the dragons. As to be expected of Framestore, the CGI is spectacular, and the animated dragons are far and away the best part of the show, but I think that goes without saying. The show does unfortunately have a lot of reused shots, especially with the mountain dragon, as well as the weird use of the forest dragon's model in the scenes that are supposed to be the marine dragon. Said scenes all look fantastic though, so I don't think it's that big a deal. The practical effects by crawly creatures are also superb. 20 years later, Dragons still has an undeniable appeal, despite its quirks, and I'd honestly love a revisit to this kind of premise with modern CGI. I think that has the potential to be amazing. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please do like, comment and subscribe, as it helps a ton. Bye bye now.